When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, we travel to Edinburgh to look at the fascinating story behind one of Scotland's longest-running investigations, the World's End murders.
They just had the terrible misfortune to cross paths with two evil, dangerous men.
And we go to Scamden Moor near Huddersfield to look at the science behind finding the killer of Christopher Pratt.
I like to think that the forensic entomology is providing one bit of the jigsaw evidence, and it might often be the missing one that finally solves the picture. Aberdeen, 2013. Lorna Dawson has been asked to help solve one of the UK's longest-running cold cases, the World's End murders. Lorna remembers the crime only too well.
I got a phone call from Lothian Borders Police, and they said, we've got a cold case here, and there's some soil samples that were taken from one of the victims in the World's End murders. Would you be able to look at it? I said, yes, we'll have a look at them. And I thought, goodness me, that's the case that was in Edinburgh when I was a student.
Edinburgh, 1977, a city famous for its nightlife, when suddenly two 17-year-old friends, Helen Scott and Christine Eady, were discovered murdered after a night out at the city's famous World's End pub.
I had just moved to Edinburgh as a student studying geography and geology, and it shocked us all. There was a real fear, particularly amongst my peer group, who were the same age and stage as poor Helen and Christine.
For Detective Tom Wood, the World's End case remains one of the most important of his career.
On the 15th of October 1977, Saturday, two young girls went out for a night out in Edinburgh and ended up in the World's End pub in the High Street. It's noticed that there's a couple of men join the company, and these are strangers, and they're seen speaking to Helen and Christine. At 10 o'clock, the pub's closed, and everybody leaves. So they're seen leaving, going down St Mary's Street in the company of these two men.
That was the last witness sighting of the two young women. Helen's brother, Kevin, was 11 years old. He remembers growing panic at home as the hours passed with no word from his sister.
I remember waking up and there was still a light on in the house, so I got up and my mother was sitting downstairs, wondering why Helen didn't come home. Come the next morning, obviously, there was a lot of concern. You just knew it wasn't right.
The following day, Helen and Christine's families received the news they were dreading. Their daughters' bodies had been found. First was Christine's.
A dog walker had been walking along the tide line of the beach and saw what he thought was a tailor's dummy lying on the coast. As they approached, they got closer, they realised it wasn't a tailor's dummy, it was actually the body of Christine. Just as the first tranche of detectives were coming on the scene, we got a call to say that a farmer had found the body of another girl about 5 or 6 miles away, and this was Helen.
Helen's body was found tied up, lying on top of her coat in the middle of a field.
We came from an environment where nobody locked their doors, so we were a trusting family. Helen was a trusting girl. The household was just distraught. I mean, it blows a family apart.
Police quickly secured the crime scene and began an extensive search of the area where Helen's body was found.
We were lucky in that the first response from our crime laboratory, our forensic laboratory, were scientists who were practiced in crime scene management. That morning on the 16th of October, a young South African scientist called Lester Nib, he attended at the scene, and so he took possession of the coat, he took possessions of the gaggings and the bindings.
But Lester Nib went even further. He recovered forensic evidence for which police did not yet have the science to crack, including soil samples from the body and the crime scene.
He secured these samples in a proper way and made sure that not only were they preserved properly, but that there was a clear record of everywhere they had been. And this is absolutely critical.
In 1977, forensic science was still in its infancy. It would be decades before these samples could be effectively analysed.
You know that something very important is here. You just don't have the means or the wit or the science to interpret it. So what you must do is you must retain it carefully, and you must monitor the developments of a forensic science until such times it gives up its secrets.
One piece of evidence frustrated detectives more than any other.
That's Helen's coat, and this is the lining, which was so absolutely crucial. There was a large stain, which we always presumed was the murderer.
But in 1977, there was no way for science to identify who that person was.
It was very difficult for the police to work out in those times what happened. And of course, then there was no DNA technology. So it was very difficult, even although they had samples. There was none of these new methods that are now available that could help the investigation of that crime.
For nearly 30 years, the investigation made little progress, and Helen and Christine's killer remained on the loose. Then, in 2003, advances in DNA analysis gave police the breakthrough they had been waiting for.
What they did was they looked at the stain, and if you think about that stain on Helen's coat, it's a bit like DNA soup, right? And what they managed to do was they managed to pick the individual elements out of this soup and actually create not one, but 2 male profiles and a female profile. The female profile obviously was Helen, it's her coat. The one male profile, and it was not on any database whatsoever. But the second male profile, we checked that against the database, and that came up as Angus Robertson Sinclair.
Angus Sinclair was a convicted murderer, already in prison for killing another young woman. It turned out the second DNA profile belonged to his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton. Hamilton had died in 1996. But with compelling new DNA evidence, Angus Sinclair could now be prosecuted for the murder of Helen Scott and Christine Eady. Nothing was certain, however, and Tom was worried he needed even more to guarantee a conviction.
Now, we had built up a very compelling circumstantial case surrounding that strong case of DNA, because we always suspected that what Angus Sinclair would say was, yes, I may have met them and we had consensual sex, but I didn't kill them.
Sure enough, in court, Sinclair's defense team did precisely that. Sinclair claimed the women were alive when he left them, and he denied their murder. Without more supporting evidence, he was acquitted.
I remember speaking to someone and they said, well, that's it. I remember these words, "That's it, there's nothing you can do." And I remember walking away from that thinking, somebody can do something.
It would take another 7 years of scientific progress, but that somebody would prove to be soil expert Lorna Dawson.
In the intervening period between the first trial and 2013, we had been developing methodology to look at the organic profile in soil. So soils vary across a landscape, but they also vary with depth. Because soil can be georeferenced, the inorganic part can tell us about what the underlying geology is, and that is mapped, so we know where it has come from. Soil helps us answer the where question.
They tried to convict Angus Sinclair in 2007 using DNA evidence alone. It wasn't enough. Now the investigation team turned to samples of soil gathered by Lester Knibb in the original investigation.
Think about building this picture. So you've not only got the strong central feature of the DNA, but you also have the background to the picture. And the background to the picture is how Helen Scott got to that place. You know, was she carried? Was she dumped? Did she walk?
In 2007, Angus Sinclair's defence team claimed Helen was still alive when he left her. They insisted someone else must have killed her. Now, brand new soil analysis techniques could prove otherwise.
So these are the traces. This is one of the aggregates from Helen Scott's feet, LD4. This is another one. Now you can see that they have different profiles.
Lorna compared these samples from Helen's feet with samples taken from around the crime scene.
This question sample from Helen's feet likely came from this grass verge, while this LD5 aggregate, which also came from her feet, shares the characteristics of this profile, which was that of the wheat field where she was found.
Lorna was beginning to piece together Helen's final moments.
So this led to the conclusion that she had likely stood or walked not only in the wheat field, but also at the grass verge, leading the prosecutors to conclude that she had indeed been alive at that time and likely walked to her death.
This discovery would prove a major breakthrough, especially when combined with new evidence from the tights used to bind Helen.
Between 2007 and 2013, DNA evidence had come on. We could tell a lot more from the knots and bindings. When we undid the bindings, we found low copy samples of Angus Sinclair's DNA, and we could show through expert witnesses that these knots had not only been tied by him, but they had been tied tightly by him.
Lorna's soil evidence proved Helen had walked to where she had been killed. Meanwhile, the DNA from the bindings put Sinclair with her body.
We needed evidence from experts like Lorna so as to support the DNA case. It was very important to build up that sequence of events. We could then show that she had not wandered off, that she had been walked into the field to be killed. All building up that compelling picture which Angus Sinclair could not wriggle out of.
The team now had enough to start a brand new prosecution. The trial was scheduled for 2014.
As the date drew for the start of the new trial, you're always going to have a concern that you're not going to get the result, the desired result, that's going to bring justice.
Everything was hanging on the new evidence. Lorna had just one chance to explain to the jury what she had found.
An expert witness must not only be an expert in their field, recognised as such, but must be able to interpret their expertise and explain that to a jury. That's critical.
I remember giving evidence in this particular case. I think people don't realise the amount of work that goes into an examination, an analysis, evaluation, and interpreting that and then presenting it in court.
Lorna's evidence not only helped contradict Sinclair's account of what happened, for the jury, it also offered a compelling account of Helen Scott's final moments.
You're describing a scene and you're painting a picture for a jury. The jury have got to get their heads round a whole three-dimensional picture of what exactly took place here. So the fact that Lorna Dawson could say, this poor girl who was murdered in this field was actually walked in was hugely compelling.
Angus Sinclair was found guilty and sentenced to 37 years, symbolic of the time it had taken to reach a conviction.
We have waited 37 years for justice. Today, that wait has ended. We finally have justice for Helen and Christine.
Angus Sinclair was one of the most evil, dangerous men to walk the face of the UK in the 20th century. I've got no doubts about saying that.
What I would say to the expert witnesses is thank you for everything you've done. The story of what happened to Helen and Christine, there was no witness that saw the crime. There was nobody that could point a finger.
Two bright young girls at the very start of their lives, what might they have achieved? What family might they have had? All of that's lost, and that's the bit that you start to think about.
The number one question that police ask me is, how long has this body been dead? Forensic entomology is providing one bit of the jigsaw evidence, and it might often be the missing one that finally solves the picture.
Scamenden Moor near Huddersfield, 2009. The body of a 51-year-old man has been found by a jogger. Police are called to the scene, and journalist Nick Britton is assigned to cover the case.
Christopher Pratt's body was found after he went missing, lying naked in wasteland near Scamenden.
Christopher Pratt was a civil servant and father of two from Grantham in Lincolnshire. His body had been on the moor for some time. Why he had been left there was a mystery. To solve it, forensic investigators needed to act as quickly as possible, as retired detective Roy Lambert explains.
You only get one chance of examining a scene. If you don't get it right first time, it's called a golden hour, but that's not a golden hour. It can last for days or weeks. It's about getting the examination of the scene, of the victim, right first time.
For detectives, there was one question that needed to be answered as soon as possible.
Where bodies are found and have been in place for quite a while, it's important to try and find an approximate time of death. Now, there's various means that can be done with that. One of the things is using insects. In the case of the murder of Mr. Pratt, that then helped the investigators piece together his movements, which ultimately led to the offender.
Martin Hall is an entomologist, an expert in insects. Once based at the Natural History Museum, he's now frequently called on as an expert witness to determine time of death in numerous murder investigations.
I've been working as an expert witness in the field of forensic entomology for about 30 years now. Establishing time of death is really important. It sets the whole timescale for the investigation. I like to think that the forensic entomology is providing one bit of the jigsaw evidence, and it might often be the missing one that finally solves the picture.
Martin's ability to determine time of death is all down to the life cycle of blowflies. When a body is left in the open air, they're quickly attracted to it and lay eggs. Larvae hatch from these eggs, and it's their rate of development that provides Martin with vital clues.
The life cycles of all blowflies are very similar, so egg to larva to puparia to adult fly, but the rates of development can vary. So it's very important to get the identification correct if you want to get the timing right.
Martin began an analysis of the insects found on Chris Pratt's body. Just as important as their species was the temperature around the body. This affects how quickly the larvae grow.
Blowflies grow almost exponentially, really rapidly, and so even subtle differences in temperature are important. The difference between these is 27 degrees and these ones just 21 degrees, only 6 degrees, but they're much, much bigger in the jar here. If you don't take into account temperature, then there's no way you can tell how old the insects are. In a way, unlike us, they don't just age in days, they age proportional to heat as well. So there's no way at all of telling how old these maggots are by just looking at them. What you need to do is take into account the temperature data. Without that, there's no way that you can provide an accurate estimate of their age.
Scamandon Moor has a microclimate very different to the surrounding area. In order to prove how long Christopher Pratt had been lying there, Martin needed to work out the temperatures at the scene where the body was discovered.
Not surprisingly, there wasn't a convenient weather station right by the body, and so what we needed to do was try to get estimates of what the actual scene temperatures were. So a data logger was placed there by the scenes of crime officers. So this is a typical data logger. They record temperature and relative humidity. Basically, they enable you to put the temperature recording device at the scene where the body was found, and you can record for ideally something like 10 days after the body was removed, and then you can relate the temperatures from the data logger to those at a nearby weather station for the same period. What this allowed us to do is then actually work out what temperatures the insects were experiencing and how fast they would develop.
While Martin continued his analysis, the police investigation also made progress. They discovered that Christopher Pratt had been seen with a man called Desmond Lee.
Desmond Lee's a very dangerous man, and by the time he met Christopher Pratt, he'd already served one life sentence for murder. Having murdered his landlady, he'd been let out after serving 14 years. He'd been let out on what's called a life licence. He met Christopher Pratt in a gay sauna in Dewsbury. They became good friends. They struck up a sexual relationship.
Desmond Lee immediately became a person of interest to the investigation, but key to deciding whether he could in fact be the killer was knowing when Chris Pratt had died. Entomologist Martin Hall had the answer.
We now had a knowledge of the temperatures at the scene. We had our knowledge that the biggest maggots were around about 11 millimeters long. From the laboratory studies, although they were somewhat limited, we had a pretty good idea of how long it would take for those larvae to develop to that size at the temperatures that we found at the scene. And so we were able to determine when those eggs were first laid on the body.
Martin's evidence showed Christopher Pratt's body lay on the moor for over 6 days until it was discovered. At last, detectives had a likely time of death. They now looked for CCTV from around this time. When they found footage of Chris entering Desmond Lee's flat, they brought Lee in for questioning.
Once, if you're lucky, you've established a time frame of when a person may have died. As an investigator, you can then use that when you're going questioning witnesses and suspects to find out where they were during that period, to establish either an alibi or they haven't got an alibi.
Desmond Lee had no alibi. Under questioning, he admitted Christopher had died in his flat, but claimed it was an accident.
His neck was broken, his voice box was crushed during an extremely violent act.
Lee claimed he put Chris's remains on the moors out of panic, yet detectives could show that before he even moved the body, Lee had sufficient nerve to use Chris Pratt's credit cards for a personal spending spree.
He paid off his mobile phone bill that night. The next day, bought a load of goods from a supermarket. He then went back to the flat, bundled Christopher's body into his car and drove it to wasteland and just dumped it. The callousness to do that is truly extraordinary.
April 2010, at Leeds Crown Court, Desmond Lee stood trial for the murder of Christopher Pratt.
During the trial, the weight of evidence stacked up and stacked up against Desmond Lee. Of course, we had CCTV footage of Christopher Pratt entering Desmond's flat. We have the forensic entomologist saying that he had been in the field for pretty much the entire time since he was last seen. We have Desmond Lee's history. He's a convicted killer. And all of these things added up and led to the jury convicting unanimously Desmond Lee of Christopher Pratt's murder.
The judge sentenced Desmond Lee to life imprisonment.
In this case, like in all cases where we're able to help the police investigation convict a killer, it's very satisfying to know that that person will hopefully not be able to commit any further crimes. And of course, it helps the family gain some sort of closure. My working in forensic entomology is an area of science that I never, in my wildest dreams, ever expected to get into. And it's shown me aspects of human nature that I'm just astonished how callous some people can be.